I wanted to take a step back and put the Russia-Ukraine crisis in a larger historical context. So I decided to talk to Condoleezza Rice. Before she hit the national and global stage, she was a scholar of political science focusing on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, she served as Director of Soviet and East European Affairs on the National Security Council of George H.W. Bush. Then under the younger President Bush, she served, of course, as National Security Advisor and then Secretary of State. She is now the director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I spoke to her there earlier this week. Condoleezza Rice, pleasure to have you on.
Great to be with you, Fareed.
When was the first time you met Vladimir Putin?
I first met Vladimir Putin when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and he was serving as deputy mayor to the reformist Anatoly Sobchak. And I remember this man standing in the corner. He looked a little bit out of place, and I walked over to him. And I said hello, and he said hello. We didn't talk very much. I don't remember much of what was said. And then in July of 2001, when I was with President Bush in Slovenia, and I looked up, and here came toward us the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. And I thought, oh my goodness, I now remember it's that same man.
So when you met him as National Security Advisor for the first time, what was your first impression of him as a statesman?
I thought that in that first moment when we met him with President Bush for the first time, that he seemed almost a little bit shy, a little bit reticent. He walks like an athlete. There's a certain presence to him as he sort of strides in. But then as you began to talk to him, he didn't really look you in the eye. He seemed a little bit unnerved, maybe, about meeting the President of the United States for the first time. Needless to say, he went pretty quickly from shy to confident to arrogant to megalomaniacal. But those first few times, I thought he was actually a little bit lacking in confidence.
Russia was very poor at the time. It was indebted. He needed debt relief. He needed foreign aid. The price of oil was very low. Do you think that was part of it, that as Russia recovered from the post-communist collapse, his own confidence grew and grew?
There is no doubt. I think that the level of confidence of Putin and others in the Russian leadership grew almost exactly in line with the price of oil. It is absolutely the case. Remember that this first meeting takes place in 2001. He's only been brought in by Yeltsin in '99. This is after the essential collapse of the Soviet economy with the crisis of 1998. And I do think that they were trying to find their footing. And they were also, and Putin in particular, he was looking for some kind of strategic relationship with the United States.
So my sense of it, at least, is that he would tell a slightly different story. So I remember once when I interviewed him once, and on the sidelines of it, he says to me at one point, he says, you know, in 1999 and 2000, and he spoke in English, as you know,
Yes.
He speaks it slowly and a little haltingly, but quite clearly. He said, Bill Clinton and I, and even the Bush administration and I, we actually talked about Russia maybe joining NATO. And he said, look at where we have come now, with NATO coming closer and closer to our borders. So in his mind, I think, it's fair to say, right, that he viewed NATO expansion as sort of kicking Russia while it was down.
It's so interesting, Fareed, because he had that conversation with you. He wouldn't raise it with us.
Interesting.
I really don't remember a conversation in which he raised issues about NATO expansion. This came quite a bit later, when he began to, as the Russians have a tendency to do, misremember the conversation between Jim Baker and Eduard Shevardnadze, in which Baker supposedly said that we would never move NATO east. But of course, in the 90s, this was about German unification. This was not in 89, 90. Nobody was even thinking of the Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary becoming members of NATO. And the only time that I can remember it beginning to be a problem about where NATO was moving was when we began to think about putting missile defenses in Poland and in Romania and perhaps some interceptors in the Czech Republic. At that point, he started to talk about the use of this territory to threaten the interest of Russia. But before that, in all the conversations that we had with him, he didn't make the case that we were, quote, encircling him.
But by 2008, the Bucharest Declaration, NATO basically says we have an open door to Georgia and to Ukraine. Your ambassador to Moscow at the time, Bill Burns, who is now the director of the CIA, wrote a series of cables, which thanks to various leaks we have, in which he said, and they were addressed to you, he said, this is a terrible mistake. For any Russian government, putting Ukraine into NATO is a neuralgic issue. I've talked to liberals, I've talked to conservatives. They will never allow this, they will never forget this. Kind of prescient in its way. By then, was it clear to you that?
Well, I have the highest regard for Bill Burns, but it wasn't a surprise to me that this was the way that the Russians felt. But as you know, Fareed, because you've been in and around policymaking, you're often balancing two competing sets of values. We wanted to continue to have a good relationship with the Russians. We had created the NATO-Russia Council. The reward was that they sent someone who didn't even speak the language. So we were trying very hard to show that NATO had transformed, that it was something different. But the competing value is that NATO has always had a view that it is an alliance of democracies. And to say to Ukrainians or to Georgians, you're still in the Russian sphere, and therefore we have to cut this line at a particular point, and we can't allow you to even be considered. To say to these young democracies, you could never be a member of this club, that was something we weren't willing to say.
When we come back, I will ask Secretary Rice, what is next for Ukraine? Can that country flourish when Russia is determined for it to fail? Now back to my interview with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. I sat down with her on Tuesday at Stanford University. Are you surprised, given how the Europeans in '08 and even after Crimea were not very willing to put in very tough sanctions, that this time around they do seem to have come around to a view of maybe some stronger sanctions?
Well, I hear that there would be crippling sanctions, but I think we'd have to see what the specifics would look like. If there was that little slip of the president that it sort of depended on the nature of what the Russians did. And I'm not sure that we would see the kinds of crippling sanctions, for instance, banking sanctions, that would deny dollar-denominated transactions to the Russians if we had more limited activity.
President of Ukraine says that maybe NATO membership is a dream. Do you think that at the end of the day, where we are going to come out of this is
soldiers on the Ukrainian border to the east and 30,000 or whatever it is on the border with Belarus. That's a pretty big mobilization to get somebody to say something that's a penetrating glimpse into the obvious. And I kind of wonder if that's enough for him. I have a sense that Putin has set in motion some things that he did not intend to set in motion. And maybe there is a rethinking in Moscow about what has been achieved by this huge buildup, by all of these threats, by the threatening exercises that have taken place, by the narrative that has been created in the Russian press and in other places about the dangers to Russian-speaking populations in the eastern part of the Ukraine. That's an awfully big buildup, and one wonders whether he underestimated NATO, underestimated the response that would bring, perhaps thought that he could intimidate maybe even the Ukrainians into something more. We will see how this comes out. But I hope he's done one other thing, which is to remind us that as much as we all want a transition from hydrocarbons in support of climate policy, if that transition takes place and leaves us out, does not allow the United States to take advantage of its tremendous assets in oil and gas, we will hand the oil card to Vladimir Putin.
Do you think, in the long run, can Ukraine survive and flourish with a Russia that is determined to kind of make it fail?
One of Putin's frustrations, I think, is that he hasn't been able to make Ukraine fail. Despite the fact that he annexed Crimea, despite the fact that he's made a mess of a third of the country in eastern Ukraine, separatist movements, no ability to deal with the Rust Belt, the horrors of living in the Donbass. Despite that, the Ukrainian economy has grown. Not a lot, maybe 2.5%, 3%. Zelensky has turned out to be, I think, a stronger president for Ukraine than perhaps the Russians expected. The feeling of being Ukrainian is growing, particularly in the West, but not just in the West. There are young people in Ukraine now who only remember an independent Ukraine. And I think that part of his frustration is that this has happened despite his efforts to undermine Ukraine, and that Ukraine keeps yearning to be a part of the West, whether NATO or not, whether European Union or not, moving closer and closer to the West. And perhaps a little bit of sense in his mind that time is running out for his vision of Ukraine, the little brother. Ukraine, the natural part of Russia. Ukraine, as he said in Bucharest in 2008, the made-up country, because it's really never been independent that long. You get a sense of his frustration. So can Ukraine survive and prosper? Yes, it will be easier if the Russians cannot do some of the things that they intend to do. But I remember giving a talk to a group of Ukrainian young legislators a few years ago. And I said, I know you have a difficult international situation, but imagine if the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, had said for that 45 years, well, we really can't progress until we have our eastern half. We can't get stronger. We can't build an economy. We can't build a democracy. But instead, they did quite the opposite. They built a powerful democracy. They built a powerful economy. And when the time came, the East Germans wanted to be a part of that, not the other way around. And so I would say to the Ukrainians and to the Ukrainian people, this is a very sad and difficult time. I hope that we are supporting Ukraine's aspirations strongly enough. I have to say that I think that the Biden administration is playing a difficult hand rather well these days. And it is ultimately, though, up to the Ukrainian people and their leadership to keep trying to build that strong, democratic, independent Ukraine that is fighting corruption and building an economy. It can be done.
Secretary Rice, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Great to be with you.